Hi everyone, and thanks for tuning in. My name is Sarinah O'Donoghue, and I'm a neurodivergent first year PhD student at the University of Aberdeen. I'm based in English literature, but I have cross supervisorship in the School of Education. My research focuses on portrayals of autism in 21st century literature and literary narratives, with a focus on space, place, and environment. Today, I'm going to give an introduction to and analysis of two popular works of the autistic self-advocacy movement, which inspired me to study autism within a literary context. These are Jim Sinclair's narrative essay, Don't Mourn for Us, published in 1993, and Mel Baggs's 8.5 minute YouTube video, In My Language, which came out in 2007. My PhD thesis examines these texts using complex theoretical approaches, but for this talk, I want to distance myself from these approaches to appeal to audiences outside of English literature and/or academia. For me, one of the most endearing things about both works is their accessibility and universality, and I wanted to acknowledge that here. So while the works aren't strictly literary in that they're not stories or works of fiction, each demonstrates how literary and narrative elements are central to how autism is represented and understood in culture. In this sense, I'm following Oxford Language's definition of literary as having a marked style intended to create a particular emotional effect. With narrative, I'm talking about how language and linguistic/structural elements are used to tell a story or relate a sequence in a particular way. An appropriate example would be the pathology and neurodiversity models of autism. While both models are concerned with the same subject, autism, the way they frame and discuss it are very different. Don't Mourn for Us and In My Language are both well known, but I hope to approach them from a fresh angle as I explore how their literary and narrative components help reframe cultural perceptions of autism. As far as I'm aware, there aren't any literary based analyses of Don't Mourn for Us, and only a few of In My Language, including some blog posts and a few paragraphs in Stuart Murray's excellent monograph, Representing Autism, Culture, Narrative, Fascination. This presentation aims to expand on these. Sinclair's and Baggs's works appeared when autism was considered by most as an illness or deficit. This was expressed through common metaphors and tropes, conflating autism with self-isolation, aloneness, and lack of volition. As many of us are painfully aware, these are still prevalent and are based on neurotypical presumptions about autistic subjectivity rather than on lived experience. Fortunately, in 2021, there are many experiential accounts written by autistics that challenge these, which wouldn't be the case if it weren't for early self-advocates, including, but not limited to, Sinclair and Baggs. By exploring themes of autonomy, empathy, and community, Don't Mourn for Us and In My Language suggested that it was society rather than neurodivergent people who needed to change. This is the underlying ethos of the neurodiversity movement, which, while acknowledging the very real struggles that being neurodivergent can bring, still views it as a difference to be embraced. But before moving on to analyse specific passages, I will provide a brief overview of both works, which will locate them within their cultural contexts. Don't Mourn for Us appeared in 1993, when autistics had almost no say in discourses involving them. In the early 90s, narratives by autistic people were only accepted in mainstream narrative portrayals if the autistic overcame their condition, or if they conformed to neurotypical expectations about what autism is. And it's fair to say that Sinclair did not. Rather than something to be obliterated or resisted, Sinclair famously states that autism is pervasive. It colors every experience, every sensation, perception, thought, emotion, and encounter. Don't Mourn for Us is based on a speech given by Sinclair, addressed primarily to parents of autistic children, and was one of the first accounts to suggest that autism is a different way of being in the world, rather than a deficit to be cured. Throughout the essay, Sinclair urges parents to consider how their autistic children feel when their parents are mourning for a child who is living, and to accept their non-autistic children for who they are, rather than wishing they were different, read neurotypical. Sarah Prippas Capit suggests that after Don't Mourn for Us was published, no longer were autistic people limited to personal narratives that relied heavily on tropes of autism as tragedy or entrapment. Autistic people could and would articulate their own views independent of parent and professional validation. Here, Prippas Capit notes that the essay's impact is owed to its persuasive literary and rhetorical techniques. However, writing from a social sciences perspective, these aren't analysed. As I hope to demonstrate, this is where a literary-based approach is useful. Baggs's video appeared more than 15 years later, when the autism self-advocacy movement had begun, but was not yet widely heard of. In 2007, autistic people still struggled to be heard, and the media was full of discourses concerning an autism epidemic. In this era, known as the Autism Wars, it was more important than ever not just to have narratives that confronted these myths and stereotypes, but also ones exploring the joys and freedoms of being autistic. In My Language begins with Baggs in their apartment, back to the camera, humming a one-note tone and flapping their hands in a way that's commonly associated with autism. A series of cuts are then introduced, each showing Baggs using different parts of their body to interact with various objects. Baggs's humming continues as we see them run their hands over a computer keyboard, flick a piece of paper in the air at an accelerating pace, repetitively click a stapler, rock back and forth with their head inside a book, and so on. Approximately halfway through, Baggs introduces a translation, which runs over further clips, while they use their augmentative communication device to explain that the first part of the video, or the wordless part, was in their, quote, native language. They ask why then people only take them seriously when they communicate using speech, and assume that they are unintellectual, uncommunicative, or shut off when they interact by engaging all their senses, as shown in the clips. The video explains Baggs isn't meant to be a, quote, voyeuristic freak show. It is meant as a strong statement on the existence and value of many different kinds of thinking and interaction. I hope the introductions to Sinclair and Baggs's works have given an idea of what they're about and why they're so important. I'm now going to conduct a comparative analysis of the texts, which will take us almost to the remainder of the talk, leaving room for a short conclusion. So both texts foreground their themes and subject matter in their opening statements. It is clear that these texts will be about autism, but that they will differ from mainstream portrayals in two key ways. First, they are narrated by people who know what it's like to be autistic, rather than by parents, carers, or professionals. Second, they suggest that autism isn't a tragedy or illness, but a different way of being. Significantly, their messages don't rely on the autist emerging from their condition into neurotypicality, which was the standard narrative format at the time. Sinclair begins Don't Mourn for Us with the statement, parents often report that learning their child is autistic is the most traumatic thing that ever happened to them. Non-autistic people see autism as a great tragedy, and parents experience continuing disappointment and grief at all stages of the child's and family's life cycle. They then assert that this grief does not stem from the child's autism in itself. In the first two sentences, Sinclair evokes a popular sentiment expressed by parents after their child receives an autism diagnosis, using terms associated with autism in media and cultural portrayals, such as grief, tragedy, and disappointment. But Sinclair makes an important distinction. It's not autism that causes these feelings, but unfulfilled societal expectations about what constitutes normalcy. Juxtaposing these two perspectives, autism as deficit and autism as neurological variation, the pathological perspective is swiftly countered by the neurodiversity paradigm, establishing the theme and anticipating what follows. In My Language is innovative in both in subject matter and delivery. The first half of the video has no words, but is nevertheless rhetorical, as Baggs explains that their stims and bodily movements are their native language, before using an augmentative communication device to voice the translation in the second half, adapting the narrative structure to suit their mode of expression, rather than attempting to communicate in ways expected or accepted by neurotypical viewers. Baggs pioneers a narrative tradition that is unapologetically autistic. Some might argue that movement doesn't merit a literary analysis, but the video's refusal to conform to fixed genres and styles is what's so powerful about it, as it offers new ways of reading, comprehending, and being. Baggs's movements are more than a type of negative space. They are dialogic and rhetorical, signifying a new direction for literary expression which encompasses all modes of thinking. Baggs's own wish for their movements to be interpreted as communication and interaction is evident in their repeated use of the word language, and in statements such as, "The way I naturally think and respond to things looks and feels so different from standard concepts or even visualization that some people do not consider it thought at all, but it is a way of thinking in its own right. However, the thinking of people like me is only taken seriously if we learn your language." As observed by Marcia Kinder, this recalls Mikhail Bakhtin's statement that encountering other languages prompts a, quote, ideological awakening, as we realize that our native language is merely, quote, one among other cultures and languages, which complicates concepts relating to origins or truth. Baggs's video therefore draws attention to the multiplicity, inventiveness, and excitement associated with language making. Dismissing it as something separate from literary and narrative expression would only reinforce its central point, which is how much value we place on neurotypical modes of expression at the expense of all others. After foregrounding their themes, the texts subvert popular metaphors used to conceive of autism, particularly those that conflate it with self-imprisonment or lack of volition. Under the subheading, "Autism is not an impenetrable wall," Sinclair challenges the idea that autism is an unwanted imposition between an individual and the rest of the world. In the spirit of Baggs, Sinclair suggests that the biggest hurdle to overcome is the narrow-mindedness of neurotypicals, who often refuse to accept non-normative communicative practices. It takes more work to communicate with someone whose native language isn't the same as yours. You're going to have to give up your assumptions about shared meanings. You're going to have to learn to back up to levels more basic than you probably thought about before. You're going to have to give up the certainty that comes with being on your own familiar territory, and let your child teach you a little of her language, guide you a little way into his world. With the anaphoric/repetitive, "you're going to have to," which also uses direct address, Sinclair achieves an assertive and almost reproachful tone, recalling how an authority figure might address a misguided child. Sinclair urges parents to change their ways to save their children from a lifetime of misery. They suggest elsewhere in the piece that if parents can't let go of their want for a neurotypical child in place of their autistic one, they should seek counseling or therapy. This subverts popular narrative, stating that autistic behaviors and ways of being are wrong or unacceptable and should be corrected, placing the onus on neurotypicals to change. Through subversion, Sinclair imagines a world where autistics can be themselves and where normative standards are things of the past. It is clear then why Don't Mourn for Us is often cited as the manifesto of the neurodiversity movement. Sinclair also uses subversion to destabilize common metaphors that position autistic people as shut off or in a world of their own. They say, each of us who does learn to talk to you is operating in alien territory, making contact with alien beings. We spend our entire lives doing this, and then you tell us that we can't relate. Alien metaphors, as Alicia Broderick and Ari Neiman suggest, are traditionally used by neurotypicals in autism discourses to metaphorically exclude autistic people from the geographic landscape of what may be considered normalcy. Sinclair suggests that it's neurotypicals that make life confusing and treacherous for autistics, which reappropriates the metaphor and draws attention to the way autistic people are othered in common portrayals. Baggs also confronts popular autism metaphors when they state, ironically, the way that I move when responding to everything around me is described as being in a world of my own. Whereas if I interact with a much more limited set of responses, people claim that I am opening up to true interaction with the world. This confronts misconceptions of autism as an impenetrable wall or undesirable barrier between self and world. Responding by reacting physically to all parts of their surroundings, Baggs responds not only by adding another metaphor to decipher, but by showing their most authentic and articulated self. In a clip of them running their hand underwater, they explain, in this part of the video, the water doesn't symbolize anything. I am just interacting with the water as the water interacts with me. In this way, Baggs doesn't merely deconstruct the metaphor of the autistic person being in a world of their own, but eschews metaphoric representation altogether in favor of a more embodied rhetoric. This bodily rhetoric is, above all else, rooted in joy, freedom, and liberation. It is a celebration of the autist's sensory world and the modes of feeling and interaction this affords. This is reinforced in I smell things, I listen to things, I feel things, I taste things, I look at things. As the repetition here is almost incantatory, emphasizing the scope and extent of Baggs's embodiment and immersion in their surroundings. I can sing along with what is around me, Baggs says. If neurotypicals can't learn their tune, they should at least respect its existence. This presentation considered two salient works of the autism self-advocacy movement, Sinclair's Don't Mourn for Us and Baggs's In My Language. It was suggested that the works are so powerful because of their literary and narrative components, and in the case of Baggs's video, the way it was delivered. Both works confront harmful misrepresentations of autism, reject the idea that it is something to be overcome or emerged from, instead suggesting that it is a valid part of a person's identity. Their use of techniques including subversion, metaphor, anti-metaphor, repetition, direct address, and reappropriation don't merely create another autism narrative to add to the ones written by medical professionals and parents. Rather, they pioneer a new literary movement altogether, which has autistic culture and modes of expression at its core. Thank you.